Part 2, The 50-Year Ridicule. How did the myth of emancipation operate culturally over a 50-year period to anesthetize women's political consciousness? In the 20s, eroticism came in big. The gradual blurring together of romance with the institution of marriage began. Quote, love and marriage, go together like a horse and carriage, end quote, serving to repopularize and reinforce the failing institution, weakened by the late feminist attack. But the convalescence didn't last long. Women were soon reprivatized, their new class solidarity diffused. The conservative feminists, who at least had viewed their problems as social, had been co-opted, while the radical feminists were openly and effectively ridiculed. Eventually, even the innocuous committee women of other movements came to appear ridiculous. The cultural campaign had begun. Emancipation was one's private responsibility. Salvation was personal, not political. Women took off on a long soul search for fulfillment. Here in the 20s is the beginning of that obsessive modern cultivation of style, the search for glamour. You too can be Theta Bara, a cultural disease still dissipating women today. Fanned by women's magazines of the Vogue, Glamour, Mademoiselle, Cosmopolitan variety. The search for a different, personal style with which to express oneself replaced the old feminist emphasis on character development through responsibility and learning experience. In the 30s, after the Depression, women sobered. Flapperism was obviously not the answer. They felt more hung up and neurotic than ever before. But with the myth of emancipation going full blast, women dared not complain. If they had gotten what they wanted and were still dissatisfied, then something must be wrong with them. Secretly, they suspected that maybe they really were inferior after all. Or maybe it was just the social order. They joined the Communist Party, where once again they empathized mightily with the underdog, unable to acknowledge that the strong identification they felt with the exploited working class came directly from their own experience of oppression. In the 40s, there was another world war to think about. Personal hang-ups were temporarily overshadowed by the spirit of the war effort. Patriotism and self-righteousness, intensified by ubiquitous military propaganda, were their own kind of high. Besides, the cats were away. Better yet, their thrones of power were vacant. Women had substantial jobs for the first time in several decades. Genuinely needed by society to their fullest capacity, they were temporarily granted human, as opposed to female, status. In fact, feminists are forced to welcome wars as their only chance. The first long stretch of peace and affluence in some time occurred in the late 40s and the 50s. But instead of the predictable resurgence of feminism, after so many blind alleys, there was only the feminine mystique, which Bredi Friedan has documented so well. This sophisticated cultural apparatus was hauled out for a specific purpose. Women had gotten hired during the war, and now had to be made to quit. Their new employment gains had come only because they had been found to make a convenient surplus labor force for use in just such time of crisis, and yet one couldn't now just openly fire them. That would give the lie to the whole carefully cultivated myth of emancipation. A better idea was to have them quit of their own volition. The feminine mystique suited the purpose admirably. Women, still frantic, still searching, after all, a factory job is no man's idea of heaven either, even if it is preferable to a woman's caged hell, took yet another false road. This one was perhaps worse than any of the others. It offered neither the shallow sensuality of the 20s, the commitment to a false ideal of the 30s, nor the collective spirit, propaganda, of the 40s. What it did offer women was respectability and upward mobility, along with disillusioned romance, plenty of diapers and PTA meetings, Margaret Mead's mother nurture, family arguments, endless and ineffective diets, TV soap operas and commercials to kill the boredom, and, if the pain still persisted, psychotherapy. Good Housekeeping and Parents magazines spoke for every woman of the middle class, just as True Confessions did for the working class. The 50s was the bleakest decade of all, perhaps the bleakest in some centuries for women. According to the 1950 version of the myth, women's emancipation had already been tried and found wanting, by women themselves no doubt. The first attempt to break away from a stifling creative motherhood seemed to have failed utterly. All authentic knowledge of the old feminist movement by this time had been buried, and with it the knowledge that women's present misery was the product of a still virulent backlash. For the youth of the 50s, there was an even more sophisticated cultural apparatus, teenagerism, the latest guise of that persevering romanticism so bent on shoring up by cultural fiat a crumbling family structure. See Chapter 7, The Culture of Romance. Young girls of all ages dreamed of escaping the dull homes of their mothers through teenage romance. The parked car, an established tradition since the era of the flappers, became an urgent necessity, perhaps the one prop that best characterized the passions of the 50s. See Edward Keinholz's Environment of the Parked Car. The rituals of the high school dating game compared in formality with the finest of Deep South chivalric tradition, its 20th century belle, now a baton-twirling, Sweet 16 cheerleader. The highest goal that a girl could achieve was popularity, the old pleasing grace in modern form. But the boys couldn't take it. The cloying romanticism and sentimentality designed to keep women in their place had side effects on the men involved. If there was to be a ritual of girl chasing, some males too would have to be sacrificed to it. Barbie needed a Ken, but dating was a drag. Can I borrow the car tonight, Dad? Surely there must be an easier way to get sex. Frankie Avalon and Paul Anka crooned to teenage girls. The boys were tuned out. In the 60s, the boys split. They went to college and down south. They traveled to Europe in droves. Some joined the Peace Corps. Others went underground. But wherever they went, they brought their camp followers. Liberated men needed groovy chicks who could swing with their new lifestyle. Women tried. They needed sex. Women complied. But that's all they needed from women. If the chick got it into her head to demand some old-fashioned return commitment, she was uptight, screwed up, or worse yet, a real bring-down. A chick ought to learn to be independent enough not to become a drag on her old man. Translation: clinging. Women couldn't register fast enough. Ceramics, weaving, leather talents, painting classes, literature and psychology courses, group therapy, anything to get off his back. They sat in front of their various easels in tears. Which is not to suggest that the chicks themselves did not originally want to escape from Nowheresville. There was just no place they could go. Wherever they went, whether Greenwich Village circa 1960, Berkeley or Mississippi circa 1964, Haight-Ashbury or the East Village circa 1967, they were still only chicks, invisible as people. There was no marginal society to which they could escape. The sexual class system existed everywhere. Culturally immunized by the anti-feminist backlash, if, in the long blackout, they had heard of feminism at all, it was only through its derogation. They were still afraid to organize around their own problem. Thus they fell into the same trap that had swallowed up the women of the 20s and 30s, the search for the private solution. The private solution of the 60s, ironically, was as often the bag of politics, radical politics, thus more marginal and idealistic than the official, segregated arenas of power, as it was art or academia. Radical politics gave every woman the chance to do her thing. Many women, repeating the 30s, saw politics not as a means toward a better life, but as an end in itself. Many joined the peace movement, always an acceptable feminine pastime, harmless because politically impotent. It yet provided a vicarious outlet for female anger. Others got involved in the civil rights movement, but though often no more directly effective than was their participation in the peace movement, white women's numbered days in the Black movement of the early 60s proved to be a more valuable experience in terms of their own political development. This is easy to detect in the present-day women's liberation movement. The women who went south are often much more politically astute, flexible, and developed than women who came in from the peace movement, and they tend to move towards radical feminism much faster. Perhaps because this concern for the suffering of the blacks was white women's closest attempt since 1920 to face their own oppression, to champion the cause of a more conspicuous underdog is a euphemistic way of saying you yourself are the underdog. So just as the issue of slavery spurred on the radical feminism of the 19th century, the issue of racism now stimulated the new feminism. The analogy between racism and sexism had to be made eventually. Once people had admitted and confronted their own racism, they could not deny the parallel, and if racism was expungible, why not sexism? I have described the 50-year period between the end of the old feminist movement and the beginning of the new in order to examine the specific ways in which the myth of emancipation operated in each decade to diffuse the frustrations of modern women. The smear tactic was effectively used to reprieve women of the 20s and the 30s, and thereafter it combined with a blackout of feminist history to keep women hysterically circling through a maze of false solutions. The myth had effectively denied them a legitimate outlet for their frustration. Therapy proved a failure as an outlet. See the following chapter. To return to the home was no solution either, as the generation of the 40s and the 50s proved. By 1970, the rebellious daughters of this wasted generation no longer, for all practical purposes, even knew there had been a feminist movement. There remained only the unpleasant residue of the aborted revolution, an amazing set of contradictions in their roles. On the one hand, they had most of the legal freedoms, the literal assurance that they were considered full political citizens of society, and yet they had no power. They had educational opportunities, and yet were unable and not expected to employ them. They had the freedoms of clothing and sex mores that they had demanded, and yet they were still sexually exploited. The frustrations of their trapped position were exacerbated by the development of mass media, see Chapter 7, in which these contradictions were nakedly exposed, the ugliness of women's roles emphasized by precisely that intensive character which made of the new media such a useful propaganda organ. The cultural indoctrinations necessary to reinforce sex role traditions had become blatant, tasteless, where before they had been insidious. Women, everywhere bombarded with hateful or erotic images of themselves, were at first bewildered by such distortion. Could that be me? And finally, angered. At first, because feminism was still taboo, their anger and frustration bottled up in complete withdrawal, beatnik bohemia, and the flower/drug generation, or was channeled into dissent movements other than their own, particularly the civil rights movement of the 60s, the closest women had yet come to recognizing their own oppression. But eventually the obvious analogy of their own situation to that of the blacks, coupled with the general spirit of dissent, led to the establishment of a women's liberation movement proper. The anger spilled over, finally, into its proper outlet. But it would be false to attribute the resurgence of feminism only to the impetus generated by other movements and ideas. For though they may have acted as a catalyst, feminism, in truth, has a cyclical momentum all its own. In the historical interpretation we have espoused, feminism is the inevitable female response to the development of a technology capable of freeing women from the tyranny of their sexual reproductive roles. Both the fundamental biological condition itself and the sexual class system built upon and reinforcing this biological condition. The increasing development of science in the 20th century should have only accelerated the initial feminist reaction to the Industrial Revolution. Fertility control alone, for example, a problem for which the early feminists had no answer, has reached, in the period since 1920, its highest level of development in history. The dynamics of the counter-revolution which, in conjunction with temporal crises such as war and depression, obstructed the growth of feminism I have attempted to describe. Because of such obstruction, new scientific developments that could have greatly helped the feminist cause stayed in the lab, while social sexual practices not only continued as before but were actually intensified in reaction to the threat. Scientific advances which threaten to further weaken or sever altogether the connection between sex and reproduction have scarcely been realized culturally. That the scientific revolution has had virtually no effect on feminism only illustrates the political nature of the problem. The goals of feminism can never be achieved through evolution, but only through revolution. Power, however it has evolved, whatever its origins, will not be given up without a struggle.